We are back today with Janus Academy. This is the continuation of the Historical Analogies course. This is lecture number 5, where we're going to be talking about Renaissance and Pointillism, the style that was named Neo-Impressionism by some, Pointillism by others. Pointillism has a very interesting analogy with the Gothic style, and this is not the only one, so this comes as a great continuation into today's story. We can connect the previous lecture to this one that we're going to be having today. The way that Pointillism is connected to Gothic style is a for all in its appellation. We can say that Gothic style, as we mentioned, was a derogatory term, was used to show this style as ugly, unbecoming, very far removed from ideas of classical antiquity and classical beauty. So you could say that this was an appellation that was not given to the style by its creators, but by its detractors and its critics. Same is the case with Pointillism. So this style was not called Pointillism by artists themselves. They were rather labeling it as Neo-Impressionism, but was called that way by critics. Though the difference might be, if you will, that these critics were contemporary to the style, whereas when it comes to Gothic, they came centuries later. So it was nicknamed this way because, as you can imagine, if you're familiar with pointillist painting, it's all made of dots. So this is something that we're going to be talking about today. It's a very peculiar, very unique way of visual expressing oneself, and we don't really have a lot of these paintings around, meaning that this style was not directly influential the way some other styles were. One of the reasons may be because it's so difficult and peculiar to paint not by brush strokes but by dots, applying dots. So really we shall explain that this is closer to the printing process than it is to the painting process. But back to the point, the analogy between Renaissance and Pointillism. We are using the term Renaissance, of course, that was again not deployed by artists themselves. This was an a posteriori appellation, but in this case it wasn't derogatory. Renaissance was seen as something great, as the revival of spirit, as the revival of beauty, many different things, and we'll address some of them today. The main, I would say, similarity between these two styles is that they come after a period of very intense struggle of great political instability. So you could argue that one of the ways that Renaissance style came about was, we already mentioned this, fall of Constantinople, 1453. The other important way situates the arrival of the Renaissance a full century earlier, with the arrival of the Black Plague. This was arguably a far greater calamity than the fall of Constantinople. The proper term is Black Death, though many people, including myself, often say Black Death, Black Plague erroneously. So it is really Black Death. We're talking about the bubonic plague, the absolute worst calamity that befell Europe in its entire history. The competition here is very strong, but still this one takes the cake because the Black Death, bubonic plague, took something between 30 to 50% of European lives. This is really hard to imagine. We're talking about between 120 to 200 million people in the entire Eurasian continent. Now, if you think about this particular moment in the world, how many people we've had total, you understand that this indeed was a great tragedy. So the idea was that the Black Death killed a lot of painters. It killed a lot of everyone, really, but especially the painters, because they tended to be situated in urban environments, and the plague struck cities much more harshly than it did villages. And this was due to the simple fact that there were many more people living in the city. They were living closer to one another. It was easier to spread the disease. So you could say that what happened, one of the things that brought about the Renaissance style was a very banal reason, very simple reason, that a lot of the painters who were familiar with the medieval style, that were copying Byzantine style one way or the other, simply died off. They were no longer around. So the new generation of painters had to invent a new style. You could argue that there is a spiritual dimension to this as well, because not only that the old generation of painters was wiped away, it was also this peculiar situation that populace of Europe lost a lot of its faith. They lost a lot of their faith and trust they had in the institution of the church, as well as in God and religion in general. The reason why this is the case is that many priests showed fear when they needed to go and give last confessions to people who were struck with the plague, people that were dying. So priests didn't necessarily want to expose themselves to the disease. This was very suspicious to everyone around them, because if you spend your entire life preaching the beauty of afterlife, the kingdom of heaven, and all the marvels that will bestow upon you if you're a good Christian, and then you show fear in face of dying, this shows to a certain extent that you don't necessarily believe in your own story, and this is never good. This is never good for business. So you could say that people also ask themselves a very simple question: why would God allow such calamity? Why would God allow such a disaster to fall upon us? You could argue that this happened in several different historical instances. The other very famous one was the Lisbonian earthquake that destroyed the entire city, that killed tens of thousands of people, and was seen as this mindless destruction that had no reason, had no purpose, that was really impossible to explain. So a great loss of human life, great loss of property, of buildings, of streets, of everything, for no good reason whatsoever. So people that had their belief and their faith founded in logical outcomes, in action and reaction, cause and effect, found themselves deeply shaken by these events. And the plague was one of those things. So you could say that the church lost a lot of its support with regular people. And this whole idea of divine plan was not quite as attractive, was not quite as persuasive as it was before. So these were all the circumstances that brought about the Renaissance style. Now, in the other end, we can say that 19th century in France, which is when Pointillism appears, late 19th century, 80s of the 19th century to be more precise, is a very politically turbulent period. We've addressed this before when we talked about Impressionism, and the same is true with Pointillism, because really, for most of it, they happen alongside one another. They coexist. So when we're talking about 80s and 90s of the 19th century, when we were talking about the very beginning of the 20th century, Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism or Pointillism coexist. They happen at the same time. So this means that they're sharing the same society, they're sharing the same zeitgeist, the same moment, and that all of the political struggles and all of the political insecurities that were around with the style of Impressionism were also around with the style of Neo-Impressionism, that is Pointillism. So we've had several different revolutions. We had the first empire fall, well, the first republic, you might argue, then the first empire, then it fell apart. Then we had the period of restoration that also fell apart. Then empire again, the second empire with Napoleon III, that too collapsed. Different revolutions, Three Glorious Days in 1830, Spring of Peoples in 1848, Parisian Commune in 1871. These were all, after a while, failed attempts at a better life, at a better state. So people felt like, again, there were new revolutions just around the corner. There was this great air of instability, and there was this great disbelief and mistrust when it came to state institutions, when it came to culture, not to speak of the church and other more lofty moments, ideals or ideas. So you could say that both of these styles come as a reaction to instability, not only political, but social and indeed spiritual instability. So the Renaissance is very interesting in this regard, because the Renaissance really is in many cases attributed to, how should we put this, the breakthrough of paganism into the Christian mainstream. We say that Renaissance brought about pagan culture and brought about it in a very important way. So we know that Christian medieval style, be it Byzantine or Western European, was all about very emaciated figures, very skinny figures. Skin tone was dark. It was either gray or green or brown, but not brown in terms of ethnicity, but brown in terms of aged, weathered, cracked, how should we say, used and abused skin. So this was to represent bodies as weak, as pale, as temporal, basically. And then when Renaissance style comes along, gradually we start having better and better human bodies, more muscular, pinky-cheeked, more beautiful. So we go back to basically this pagan way of representing the bodies. We go back to admiration of beauty, of power, of defined muscles, of accurate anatomies, and all of the things that pagan sculpture, when I say pagan, I mean Greco-Roman, is famous for. So we go back to basically representing paintings and statues as pagans have. And this, of course, is tremendously controversial because Christianity sought very hard in its early ages, in its early inception, to fight against pagans and to fight against anything that is pagan. We know that there was an entire civil war waged in the Byzantine Empire in the 8th century that was called iconoclasty. So this was explicitly against usage of images. We had iconoclasts, we had iconophiles, and they waged an entire war one another over whether they should use images in the church or not. Now, with the Renaissance, we go fully and uninhibitedly into this idea that we should use images, that we should use pagan images, and that we should really integrate paganism into Christianity. Now, although the Renaissance style is very famous for this, and no one disputes the close connection between paganism and Renaissance, between classical antiquity and Renaissance, indeed we talked about this in the introductory video, I would argue that this major intrusion of paganism into Christianity does not begin with the Renaissance style, it begins with Gothic style, because Gothic style really has to do with very sensual communication of faith. It really has to do with making a mass appeal to all of our senses. More in particular, using a beautiful light that comes through stained glass windows. So this is the part that has to do with impressionism, what we were talking about later, infusing the image with light, flooding the image and space with light, rendering image more spiritual in this particular regard. So it's not only about visuals, which are sensual, because we use the sense of sight to observe anything that's visual. It's also about the usage of music, it's about usage of frankincense, usage of wine and wafers, so all of your senses are engaged. And Christian Mass, Marian Catholic Mass, becomes a very sensual affair. This all happens in Gothic style. So if you enter a Gothic church and you see just how amazing the light is, you see how pleasant the music is, how pleasant the scent is, truly you are being communicated through your senses. Your senses are used to communicate, and this is exactly what pagans are doing. Pagans worship images, they worship statues rather than the word, which is the case with Christians. So we have this idea that Renaissance style turns itself, or rather continues what was already begun with Gothic style, integrating paganism into the Christian mainstream and using pagan devices of communication to present itself and to basically share the faith, to share their own version of Christianity, if you will. Now you can see how this all makes even more sense if we take into consideration the plague, if we take into consideration the political instability of the entire 19th century France. So you could say that people start losing their faith on one end on account of the plague, on the other on account of the political instability, many failed revolutions that took place in France. Now, when people start losing faith, they need to find it through different means. They need alternatives. And you could argue that alternatives were found in both of these cases in something that we can broadly label as science. Now, this is where it becomes interesting. Nowadays, especially in the United States of America, but also a lot of Europe, we have this entirely false and downright 100% wrong dichotomy presented to us, not to say imposed upon us, that on one end we have the church as an institution, on the other end we have science also as some sort of institution. And we think that either you can believe and be a man of the faith or a person of faith, it doesn't matter. On the other end, you can believe in science. Now, see how ridiculous this sounds, belief in science. It's a contradiction. A scientific method should not have anything to do with belief if we are to understand it in its original meaning. But indeed, it does. And you could say that this dichotomy is ridiculous and completely anachronous because throughout most of the history, it was church that developed science. It was church that dealt with most of the science. Indeed, church invented most of scientific discoveries. And for a very long period of time, church was really the main founder and the main impulse behind all of scientific discoveries. So you cannot really separate these two. Enough is said about the fact that church founded the university. The institution of the church founded all of the most famous universities of Europe, and then later America. So there's a very strong connection between these two institutions. The thing is that you could say that the scientific method as we have it was developed out of the church as well. It was developed in particular from the heritage of scholasticism. So it's true adaptation of scholasticism that we have the scientific method. Now, I invite you to take a look at an image that I will probably find and place in the video myself, the image that is called the mythical tree of religions, or the tree of religions, where you have this metaphorical depiction of a tree, and we have oldest religions acting as roots, oldest belief systems, oldest faiths. Term religion is not really adequate for this. And we see how they develop and branch into other things. So we see that first we have animism and shamanism, then later we start having polytheism, then out of polytheism we have monotheism, then monotheism branches itself into three major Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Then Islam branches further into Sunni and Shia, Christianity branches into Orthodoxy and Catholicism, then Catholicism into Protestantism, then that explodes into many different denominations. And back to medieval Catholicism, we have scholastics as a mixture of theology and philosophy, and then out of scholastics, we have the scientific method. So the point we are trying to make here is that the scientific method, as we understood it back then, but even as we understand it today, has a lot to do with faith, and indeed has a lot to do with religion. Not to say specifically Catholic religion, though we could say this as well. So we are saying that when people state that they believe in science, they are, how should I say, wrong and right at the same time. They are using a contradiction that is even absurd to a certain extent, but to another extent they have a point, because it does truly come from faith, it does truly come from religion. Now, you could say that the people that acted in Renaissance style, painters of the Renaissance, as well as painters of Pointillism, were very much invested in science, and they were seeking a shelter in science, if you will. They were seeking refuge from the world that made no sense, from the world that was incredibly politically unstable and downright dangerous. It was very dangerous being in France in the 19th century, because all these revolutions took a lot of lives, as you can imagine. And not to speak of the Renaissance period with the plague going around and many different political instabilities that were present then, back in the day. So we have this idea that we go towards science, but we go about it in two very different manners, you could argue, as different as these periods were. Now, we can also say, just briefly, that as these periods are engaged in different modes of science and different ideas of what science is, they're also engaged in different, but to a large extent similar economic basis. So we could say that we attribute Renaissance, we connect the Renaissance very firmly to what we today know to be mercantile capitalism, something we call mercantile capitalism. So gathering of wealth that comes primarily through trade, being vested in merchant activities. So this is the idea that culture spreads through Europe, that people come together through following merchant routes. Many things develop following merchant routes, and not just in the Renaissance period, but arguably any period that ever existed. But this is especially important when it comes to Renaissance, because we could argue that mercantile capitalism is an incredibly important part of European history, because out of this necessity to trade and to travel and discover new trading routes and discover new markets, we have the beginning of the colonial period. Out of colonial period, we have the great amassing of wealth, pillaging of resources, exploitation of colonies. We have slave trade becoming a very important source of European income. And out of all of these things, we gather enough resources to launch ourselves into industrial capitalism. And this is exactly the driving force behind Pointillism and generally all of the other artistic formations that are around in the second half of the 19th century. So we have mercantile capitalism as the economic foundation of the Renaissance, and then we have industrial capitalism as the economic foundation of Pointillism, Neo-Impressionism, but also many other styles that were coexisting in this particular period. And there's a very strong connection between mercantile capitalism and industrial capitalism. But not to get into that right now. I want to go back to science, because this is really important. You could argue that the same spirit, or a very similar spirit, was a driving force behind mercantile capitalism and industrial capitalism. And this was a scientific spirit, something that had a lot of influence to these artistic styles, these stylistical formations. So you could say that science was incredibly important in the Renaissance. So we had painters who literally did not see themselves as artists, they saw themselves as scientists and engineers. You would even offend some of these people if you were to call them artists, because that's not how they saw themselves. They saw themselves as something much larger, much more important than that. Similar to that, we have science to this day, really, this didn't really change that much, be the driving force of the industrial development. We have many different inventions, machines, etc., that drive forward our economy, that drive forward production, different new modes of production, and therefore are creating the world we live in. Now, this interest in science in both Renaissance and Pointillist style produces a very curious situation. It changes profoundly how we see ourselves, how we see the world. We start looking at world in very different ways. We change our worldview. We stop looking at the world ever so slowly through lens of faith and through lens of the spirit. Spirit, I mean, as it is understood. We see the world to be less magical than it was. We start seeking rational, logical explanation for things. Now, you know that the Renaissance artists were very heavily involved with sketching and analyzing of the human body. Leonardo da Vinci is a famous example. We all saw many sketches that he's made. We saw the famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man, this analysis of the perfect proportions and how man relates to all of nature. So this is the whole thing. And we have a very similar affair being the driving force behind Pointillism, this very, very strong belief that was first launched by Descartes and then later by Lemaitre, that people are basically organic machines. Now, I have to explain this a bit better. Descartes had a theory that only human beings were spiritual and were properly conscientious, and this is basically what defined them. This is what separated them from the rest of existence. The famous saying, "I think, therefore I am," is attributed to this. So thinking really is what separates humanity from animals. On the other end, we have animals, as Descartes argued, act as organic automata. So they are basically driven by their hardware. They don't have a lot of software. This is a terrible way of saying it, but also fairly simple and adequate. So he didn't see animals as soulful creatures. He saw them as organic machines. After Descartes, there comes a philosopher Lemaitre who argues the same thing, only for humans. He claims that humans don't have a soul, we don't have a spirit, there's nothing divine about us, we too are just organic machines. We are not made of rubber or plastic or metal. We are made of bones and muscle and blood and many other things, but we are basically just machines and there's nothing more to it. So if we are looking at Pointillism, and if we are looking at the spiritual foundation of Pointillism, it's this idea that man really is a machine and that the universe in its entirety is mechanistic, that we should address the universe as if it were a machine, as if we were a machine inside a larger machine. And their entire style really was developed to reflect this belief. Their entire style was invested into understanding how we see the world. It was all about the human eye. And this is where it is very, very comparable with Renaissance, especially with works of Leonardo da Vinci. There's a very strong connection between Georges Seurat and Paul Signac on one end, and Leonardo da Vinci alongside many other Renaissance artists on the other. Now, I want to focus on Leonardo and on Seurat because their inquiry into how we see is very important. So on one end, we have Leonardo, who saw himself again as a researcher, as a naturalist, as an inventor, as an engineer, before he saw himself as an artist. So his art, his painting style was invested into innovation and especially into research. So you could say that Leonardo developed his entire style, the famous sfumato, because he was curious to understand how we see things. So you could say that all of his art was really exploration of the world. Now, what Leonardo has done was fairly illegal back in the day. Arguably, it is illegal to this day. He would dissect corpses and he would analyze them, trying to understand how the human body functions. In particular, Leonardo dissected the human eyeball. He would pluck the eyeball out of the human face. He would boil it in egg white, and then he would slice it on very thin morsels so that he could analyze the different strata, the different layers of the human eye. So in doing so, he understood that the retina acts as a prism that refracts the light, that then sends the light to the brain, sends a lot of these signals that we constantly receive through the brain, and then brain forms the image of reality. So Leonardo understood how light works, and he understood that we see thanks to light. So taking this knowledge, he reversed engineered his entire style, and he created the sfumato, which was heavily invested in light, which was basically him painting light. And it was driven by his understanding that light allows us to see, not only in general, but in particular to see depth of field and to see into space. Exactly the same thing. These people were very much interested in how the human eye functions, and their style was basically a scientific experiment into how we see. Only they took it a step further, which makes sense because they came after Leonardo. So what they were doing was that they were painting in dots. Dots of simple color that could be compared really to how the printer works. You know that the printer has four colors, four basic colors, CMYK. These are cyan, magenta, yellow, and K. K stands for black. They used K instead of B because they didn't want to confuse it with blue. So we have these four colors that are projected onto a piece of paper in very small dots. You can't really see it with your naked eye, but the dots are there. So this is used this way because of pointillists. You could argue that pixels on our screens, you will probably be watching this on some sort of a screen, pixels are inspired by pointillist research. Because what they created was this idea that you should depict the world in little dots. Pixel, as you know, is a short for picture element. It is a dot that is mostly made of one of three colors, red, green, and blue. Mixing these simple colors, we get more complex colors, and that is how we see images on our screens. So this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to mix simple colors because they understood that the human eye merges two simple colors into one more complex color. Further to this point, they were driven by this idea that we do see things in dots. And the funny thing about this is that they were right, because this is truly how we see things. So if you are to look at the science behind human sight, if you are to look at the functioning of the human eye, you can say that human retinas have 3.5 million photoreceptive cells, roughly that number. So every photoreceptive cell receives one signal of light. These are all sent to the brain via our optical nerve, so then the brain shuffles them together and creates an image of the world we see. Now, since we are so advanced, we don't really see this happening. This happens entirely too fast for us to be able to observe it. But it does happen. And if you were able to zoom into reality, you would see that it's made of dots. It's made of pixels, if you will, because these pixels would be the size of our photoreceptive cells that are, of course, very, very small. You can imagine how small they are if we can fit millions of them into one eye. It's this idea that the way we see things is scientifically explained and is scientifically analyzed through paintings. So if you look at Leonardo's paintings, you can say that the entire style has to do with his scientific research and that it has to do with the development of how we see things and how we see ourselves. Now, we would have to deny, this is just a very superficial view that I'm going to be giving first, we would have to deny all of spirituality and all of soulfulness to us to be able to perform this. So we would have to say, yes, we have an eye basically acting as a machine. It's an organic machine, it's made out of organic matter, but it still acts as a machine, and you can recreate the machine that basically has the technology of an eye. Again, monitors truly are like recreated retinas, like recreated eyeballs. So you could say that when we look at the Renaissance style now, not just Leonardo's, but all of the Renaissance style, let's say Mantegna, we are looking at some very important changes that came with it, that present a considerable difference as compared to the earlier medieval style. And one of these differences is the usage of perspective, the fact that Renaissance style features a three-dimensional space, whereas most medieval paintings don't. They're decidedly two-dimensional, especially if we're talking about Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine. So we have this idea that Renaissance people are not necessarily trying to depict things as more realistic just because. This is driven by their faith too. And this is an aspect of this lecture that will probably differ considerably from many different ways in which Renaissance was seen in encyclopedias of art and in different art history books, because the way this is presented in many instances is that we are taught about the Renaissance as this period when people starting to turn away from the church. They were embracing the scientific method. They wanted to understand the world. They wanted science instead of religion. And this is only partially true. What I'm trying to argue here is that the perspective and the correct anatomy had to do not with their desire to be rational and to abandon faith. It had to do with how their faith was developing. And this is a very important distinction to be made, because when they were trying to achieve accurate depth of field and they were trying to properly calculate the line of the horizon, they were invested in sacred geometry. And sacred geometry is a very important thing. It's present in almost all of the churches that were ever made. It's present in medieval period, but especially in the Renaissance period. It's present, of course, in Hindu and Islamic architecture, arguably the most. If you go to see a mosque, it's filled with references to sacred geometry, and it's superbly interesting as such. So this shouldn't surprise us, because we know that the Arabic people were very advanced when it came to math study, and they came to a lot of discoveries in the field of mathematics before the Western European people have. So they also integrated it in their own architecture, which is something that we may address further down the line. The point is here is that Renaissance people did not seek realism for reality's sake. They sought realism because they thought it sacred, and indeed they thought it holy. There's a big difference between these two terms. We're going to get back to those surely. So you could say that this whole idea that they were invested in math, that they wanted to see the world through this particular point of view, they wanted to see the world as mathematicians, comes from the idea that was initially presented by Pythagoras, that was then adopted by Plato, and that was later adopted by most of the church, really, and that is that God is a mathematician. This is something you probably heard many times before, that God created the universe using math as the primary tool. So this is the idea that in doing math, in applying math into how we see the world, and painting using math, and especially using sacred geometry, we are trying to get closer to God. Because we see God as mathematician, and because we see the world God created as mathematical in nature. Now you can take many different examples, and you can see how this works in many different instances. I will place some only seemingly random photos here, only seemingly random images of the snail shell, for example, or of Roman broccoli, so that you can see golden ratio and how it works on one end, and so that you can see how fractals work on the other. We can see both fractals and golden ratio immensely important in Renaissance paintings, present all over the world. We can see them in nature, in many instances in nature. So, for example, you can see the golden ratio in your index finger. I hope this camera is able to pick this up. So, this idea that you want to compose your painting using the golden ratio means that you want the smaller part of the painting to relate, the smaller part of the composition, let's say, to relate to the larger part the same way that the larger part relates to the whole. And I'm showing my index finger because this is exactly how your index finger is divided. The smaller part relates to the larger part in same proportion as the larger part is related to the whole. So you can see how this mathematical rule is integrated into the very human body. This is the case with every index finger out there. So it's this idea that these mathematical notions not only permeate our nature, but permeate the higher realm. That if we're talking in abstractions, and we are talking about divinity and spirit and God being an abstract notion, being a spiritual notion, we are talking about mathematics. So we are going back to this premise that God created the world, God infused the world with his essence, and everything is divine. So this is not the situation where painters of the Renaissance period are moving away from divinity, they're becoming more and more atheistic. Nothing could be further from the truth. No, they see the God in math, and they want to apply math into their paintings because, and this is a very important thing, they're still creating most of their paintings for the church. So you could say that if you go to any museum in the world that presents Renaissance paintings, all of those paintings were never made for museums because museums didn't exist back in the day. The first museum was created in 1792. This was the Louvre Museum. This is the very end of the 18th century, and it exclusively has to do with the French Revolution. So museums are a revolutionary institution. Before they existed, paintings were mostly made specifically for the church. And paintings were not only made to communicate the church dogma, the church message, they were made to be holy. They were made truly like the icons. So if you're looking at the Orthodox icon, you can clearly see why it is considered holy. It's not as easy when you're looking at the Renaissance or Baroque or neoclassical or especially Rococo or Mannerist paintings, because those get really decadent and weird. But indeed, they were mostly made for the church, and they were mostly made to be presented in chapels and in niches. They were presented in a very peculiar manner. So representing them in museums is always an awkward affair because they were never meant to be there. We tend to look at them as works of art today, but they were not made as works of art. They were made basically as icons. And this is important to understand because we have the very same thing happen in Pointillism, but we take a different perspective. We have this industrial, mechanicistic worldview where we look at people basically the same way we look at mechanical animals. We see ourselves as machines. We see our God as a machine. So you could say that math and industry come together so to create the new industrial world, where we see this particular world, that of industrial capitalism, basically driven by machines, driven by industry. So we too start observing ourselves as an organic machine. And this is what inspires pointillists to look at the human eye and the human body really not as a divine creation, not as perfect and beautiful, etc. No, but they look at it as something that is to be analyzed, taken apart, and something that is to be understood. So this is why their paintings are basically a scientific experiment into themselves. So this is why they are thinking about how we see things, they're thinking about how light works, and they're thinking about how we best observe light. So truly, they were researchers, they were innovators, and they were inquisitive about how the human body works. But they were inquisitive about a very peculiar angle of how the human body works, a mechanicistic view of the human body and indeed of the entire humanity. So you could argue that the Industrial Revolution was the major change. It profoundly influenced the world we live in. It influenced art and how we see art. It basically changed everything. But the thing that was changed the most was our relationship to ourselves, was our relationship to other people, and how we see one another. So it's a very different affair if you see yourself as holy and sanctly divine creation on one end, or if you see yourself as an organic machine. Because in a way, organic matter is inferior to, let's say, steel. It's much more vulnerable. It's not quite as durable, etc. So this is the world that is growingly inhabited by machines. People are mimetic in nature. We get surrounded by machines. We start seeing ourselves as machines. And there is enough evidence, if you choose to believe this, that you can say that human body is a machine, an incredibly sophisticated and complex one, but this is a legitimate worldview. You can look at the human body. You can present evidence that this is indeed. So it's an interesting thing to compare this entire worldview between these two different eras that, again, are separated by centuries. It's interesting to compare the industrial science, applied science that is happening on a very large scale and that is consuming everything and everyone, that is influencing the world in an unprecedented manner, and to compare what was going on in the Renaissance. Because again, it was driven mostly by mercantile capitalism, that is industrial capitalism on the other end. Now, I want to go back to this entire notion of spirituality, where I keep claiming that Renaissance people were not moving away from God, they were trying to move forward. I would argue that the Renaissance people were as interested in coming closer to God as the medieval people were. They just had a somewhat different methodology. They wanted to understand God through reason and through mental, intellectual faculties rather than through spiritual faculties. You could say that they removed a lot of the emotion out of it. Now, you could say that what Leonardo said on his deathbed, his last words were, "Creator, I have failed you." So he felt that he did not do enough to further his cause, that he didn't use his talents properly. He could have done more. This is, of course, very funny if we think about everything that Leonardo has done. He's one of the most productive people in the world. He discovered many different machines, invented many different machines. Rather, he has left an indelible trace in history of art, in history of engineering, in history of inventions, but he felt like he didn't do enough. And not only that he didn't do enough, he failed the Lord with his inferior effort. So you could say that Leonardo's whole goal was to please God. He did not work for his own pleasure. He did not work to get paid. He worked to please God. He wanted to realize divine design. And this is true for many other artists, for many other sculptors or painters. So they truly were not only engaged by the church and paid by the church and supported by the church, they were very religious people. Michelangelo, again, is a great example of this, a very religious individual. So they wanted their art to come closer to God. And this is a very interesting thing if we compare medieval style to Renaissance style. And we understand that medieval style is very different, because medieval style is all about the spirit, and it's all about leaving the body behind, body being temporal and ultimately not that important. We focus on spirit because that is eternal, therefore it's much more important. Now, Renaissance people were as religious and as invested in pleasing God, but they went about it in very different manner. They saw reality through very different eyes, and this is something that I want to address. This is something that has to do with sacred spaces, so not only sacred geometry that is mostly used in sacred spaces, but really with understanding of the sacred as such. And it has a lot to do with understanding of reality, with understanding of the world. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that in this particular worldview, if you're thinking about the sacred and how it pertains to reality, if you are engaged in a sacred act, if you're engaged in a ritual, let's say a sacrificial ritual, let's put things to the nth degree, to dial it up all the way to the end, the sacrificial ritual is super reality. It's super realistic. So you could argue that in this particular worldview, the sacred really is the concentration of reality. It's reality in its most condensed form. When you are in the vicinity of the sacred, you are most likely exalted, or you are terribly afraid, or both of those at the same time. So you cannot be just leisurely uninterested if you're in the presence of the sacred. No, all of your senses are going wild, because this is what we call super reality, super realism, if you will. So you could argue that in this worldview, if you enter the church as consecrated grounds, this is the space where reality thickens and where all of the experiences are heightened. This is especially true with churches that invest a lot into their interior design, that invest a lot into creating a beautiful mass or a beautiful liturgy. So these are very concentrated experiences. And these spaces are sacred because they offer us this experience of super reality. So this is a different way of looking at things. It's not looking at Christian religion as invested in spirit and as invested in something that will eventually happen after we die. No, we build, especially Catholic churches, so as to be super realistic, which means that when you enter a church, which again is especially true in Gothic churches and in Renaissance churches, you are truly transported into a superior realm of existence, into super reality. Not alternative, not alternate dimension, no, super reality, reality condensed. And this all, again, has to do with usage of colors, something that we see in impressionism, as we were previously discussing, and something we see in pointillism too, because pointillist colors, pointillist palette, on account of the very peculiar way in which they paint using dots, is much lighter and brighter than what we can usually see in other styles. So it's also this idea that we have concentration of light. Light, as you can imagine, is immensely important in both of these cases. Now, we said that Leonardo has dedicated his entire life in understanding light and creating a peculiar style that was entirely invested in light. And you could say the same thing about Signac and about Seurat, that they were entirely invested in light, in understanding light and presenting light, and that their paintings are truly light concentrated. So when we're talking about the Renaissance, we are talking about this idea of concentrated reality, of concentrated mathematical laws, of application of all these laws. And going back to this idea that nature truly is the fruit of divine labor. It's divine work. God created nature. God infused himself in nature, and nature is filled with divinity. Now, this is all very close to how pagans see the world, because pagans see the world as alive and as filled with human spirit. But you could say that it's not the fact that the Renaissance people see the world as plain, or that they see it as devoid of divinity, as atheists would. No, quite the contrary. They see divinity as mathematical, logical, rational, reasonable. So they try to access God through reason. And if you look at Renaissance paintings, you look at, let's say, Botticelli or Mantegna or aforementioned Leonardo or Raphael, there's many different examples, Titian, you see that people try to understand the world through visuals, but they found those visuals into math. Now, Raphael, another great painter of the Renaissance movement, who dealt with sacred geometry, who infused his paintings with sacred geometry, said that when he is painting a human face, he is painting the idea of beauty rather than beauty itself. And you can see that this is incredibly Platonistic. This is basically this notion that world is permeated with ideas. It's really both Platonistic and Aristotelian, because you could say that Plato argued that forms exist in their independent realm, and then they're reflected into this particular material reality in an inferior way, whereas Aristotle argued that forms exist in everything in itself. So you could argue that the human body, without the form, without the abstract notion of the human body, would basically be just a jumble of cells that would not be arranged in a human body. It would be just a pile of flesh. So because we have a form, we have a sketch, a design of a human body, we get to have it look and function as one. So it's this idea that forms truly exist in this world that drives both of these respective styles. You could say that Pointillism is trying to seek forms not only when it comes to human bodies, but when it comes to the world as such. So they're trying to understand, through understanding light, they understand everything else. And you could argue that in Renaissance and in Pointillist affairs, light has the most important role, because it's something that enables us to see. And light has this incredibly important place in the world because it's the most clear, the most obvious sign of divine presence. If you enter a Gothic church, but then later a Renaissance church, Baroque, Rococo, or classical or neoclassical church, you can see that it has entirely to do with light. It has a very, very important space dedicated to volumes of light through presence of light. And you can see that this is because light is seen as divine. Now, you could argue that people that acted as pointillist painters saw light as something that is to be analyzed from their own particular point of view, because they were driven by the industrial era and by the industrial understanding of science. So they were driven by mechanicistic vision of the world, and they saw the world again as machines. But light was fundamental in this, because even in this particular regard, light was seen as divine, as something that helps us to understand. We don't say for nothing light of reason. We don't make this analogy for nothing. We see this capacity to see into things as being divine, as being very close to intelligence, to knowledge, to divine spark of reason. So it's as if we are led to exist and to understand and to function in this mechanicistic world, because we have a mind that is also like an incredibly sophisticated, well-calibrated machine. So you could argue that when Leonardo was dissecting his corpses and when he was slicing human eyeballs so as to better understand light, This is something that not only announces both Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism, but is very similar in spirit to their desire. And the desire is to understand. It's to truly get closer to God through your mental faculties, through understanding. And this is, again, very much connected to Catholicism. It's very much connected to scholasticism. You can see how this particular understanding that you should cognate God, that you should reach God through intellectual effort, through thinking and thought, comes out of scholasticism, because this is entirely what scholasticism is all about. It's a mixture of philosophy and theology. It's this idea that you need to think about God, and you should try to understand God. Of course, you can never succeed in this, because divine mind is infinitely more complex than human, but you should nevertheless keep trying. So the idea that you reach God through your mental process, this is entirely different from Christian orthodoxy, where you need to understand God through your heart, through emotions, through basically being a compassionate, empathic, emotional person. This is closer to mysticism and is known as Orthodox mysticism. So you don't really engage your mind nearly as much. You try to have God as a lived experience. You try to understand God with your heart, not with your mind. The other part of the world, the Catholic perspective and then later Protestant, is very much in understanding God with your mind. So what I'm trying to say here is that not only that the Renaissance people were not atheistic in their effort to present and understand the world, but were very much deistic and were very much believing people. We could say the same thing about the industrial capitalistic people, the pointillist people of the second half of the 19th century, very end of the 19th century, because they had their own system of beliefs, they had their own religion that had industry at its very core. So they saw the world as a factory. Now, I'm not just saying this to make a clever analogy. I am saying this because people who sought to understand the world were very much influenced by how factories worked. Now, if you follow lectures of Professor David Harvey that you can find here online, Reading Marx with David Harvey, he argues that Charles Darwin, the famous author of the theory of evolution, was very much inspired by how factories work and how the entire free capitalistic market works when he was writing about his theory of evolution, and in particular when he was writing about competition, about this natural competition for resources and for survival. So David Harvey argues, and Marx before him argues, that Darwin was indeed inspired by capitalistic competition, by coercive nature of capitalism as he described it, and he basically created this entire theory of evolution, this entire theory of how nature works, that is one of the most important theories we have out there, looking at the human society. So he was trying to analyze nature through the lenses of human society and his particular ideological position. And you could argue the same thing about pointillism, that they're trying to understand the world, they're trying to understand how everything works from their own ideological position. And what I argue here about this is that their position is not only ideological, it is indeed religious. But it's not anchored in religion as we understand it, Christianity, be it Protestant or Catholic, in this part of the world. It is anchored in a very peculiar form of religion that has to do with industry. And it has to do with this particular time. We are talking about the 80s of the 19th century, when we have the coming together of the church and the large capital. We have this acceptance of the church that revolution has happened, that we're not going to go back to monarchy, the old world is gone. Church embraces new world, new economic mode of production. And on the other end, capitalistic forces embrace the church and they merge, they become one. So you could say that churches of St. Augustine in Paris and churches of Sacred Heart of Montmartre were made basically to seal this alliance. And then we see this whole affair, mechanicistic, industrial worldview, and on the other end, the spirituality becoming influenced and driven by it. We see them creating, producing an entire new style, an entire new way of looking at things. The way that we see things through perspective of pointillism. We are looking at humanity, we are looking at not only human bodies, but human society. We are looking at basically the world in its entirety and infinite complexity through these particular lenses, because we see everything as machines. So we have this whole idea of deus ex machina. We know that this is the term coming from Greek theater. But in this particular case, truly we create God out of a machine. And we also have anthropos ex machina, this idea that man too is a machine. If God is a machine, if God is industry, then God created man in his image. So too man is a machine, and we live in a mechanical, mechanicistic world. So this is the way for us to properly understand neo-impressionism. This is the way to understand what we also know as pointillism, is to see this as the deconstruction of the world. So we see this as simplifying the world so that we could understand it better. So you could say that post-impressionism, or neo-impressionism rather, pointillism, was very close to the style of divisionism. And divisionism really is this same attempt. It's the attempt to separate not only dots and colors, but to understand reality through division, to understand reality through categorization, not to take it in holistically, but to separate it and analyze it and approach as scientifically as we can. Now, I want to go back and conclude with this premise. We said it in the beginning that Renaissance people would be gravely offended if you were to think of them as artists, because they saw themselves as much more than that. They saw themselves as engineers and researchers and naturalists and inventors. You could say the same thing or a very similar thing about pointillists. They were truly exploring the world. They were trying to get to deeper understanding of the world, and they were driven by their particular era. Now, you could say that the second half of the 19th century was fairly influenced by scientific discoveries. It was fairly influenced by microscopes and telescopes, and this understanding that our perception is indeed very limited and we can expand it using machines. Let's say that you can see much more using an industrial scale microscope or an industrial scale telescope than you can with your bare eye. So this is the idea that through machines, people become more powerful. We can fly in a plane, and we can cross a much larger distance if we fly in a plane than by running or by walking. So we can ride a car. We can, again, observe the universe through a telescope, and we can see things that we were previously unaware of, that were previously impossible for us to see. So it's this idea that machinery helps us become almost godlike. So not only that machine is our God, but we can make ourselves godlike through machines. This is explicitly developed by the Italian futurists. We may get to talk about those in a moment. Suffice to say for the moment that both pointillism and Renaissance were driven by scientific thought, were driven by research, but that research was very much religiously inspired, and it was anchored into the scientific method. So I would be curious to hear your opinion about this. I would be curious to see, to hear if this makes sense visually, if when you're looking at Leonardo's paintings and the way he uses shadows, you can see how he was trying to build depth of field and space, and how he was using light to truly understand the universe. And if you can see the same thing in Seurat or Signac's or Croz's paintings. Hopefully you liked what you heard. Hopefully you will be able to see connection between the two, and I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. Ciao.